The Intergalactic Senate chamber erupts in chaos as news breaks of Chris Murray, a human diplomat impregnating the three notoriously unattractive daughters of King Zorn, the Iconian ruler. Senators from 100 worlds leap to their feet, shouting accusations and demands for explanations. The chamber's translucent dome trembles with a cacophony of voices, each more outraged than the last. At the center of the storm stands Ambassador Lena Chen, Earth's representative to the Senate. Her face remains impassive, but her knuckles whiten as she grips the podium. "Order!" she shouts, her voice amplified by the chamber's acoustics. "I call for order." The uproar continues unabated. A tentacled Xyloxian senator slithers up to Chen, its bioluminescent skin flashing angry patterns. "Is this how humans conduct diplomacy?" it hisses. "By defiling the royal bloodlines of their allies?" Chen takes a deep breath, her mind racing. How could Chris have done this? The 35-year-old career diplomat from Earth had been sent to the Iconian homeworld of Icarus Prime to negotiate a crucial trade agreement. The Iconians, known for their striking beauty in 8-foot-tall, iridescent blue bodies, had long been wary of humans. This mission was supposed to bridge the gap between their species, not widen it into an interstellar chasm. As Chen struggles to formulate a response, a holographic transmission flickers to life above the Senate floor. The image resolves into the towering figure of King Zorn himself, his crystalline eyes blazing with fury. The chamber falls silent, all eyes fixed on the Iconian ruler. "People of the galaxy," Zorn's voice booms, "I stand before you today, not as a king, but as a father betrayed. This human, this Chris Murray, was welcomed to our world as an honored guest. In return, he has violated our most sacred traditions and desecrated our royal bloodline." Chen's stomach churns as she realizes the full extent of the diplomatic disaster unfolding before her. King Zorn had assigned his three daughters, Rhea, Thea, and Dion, widely regarded as the least attractive Iconians in the galaxy, to act as liaisons to Chris. The king's plan had backfired spectacularly. "All three of my daughters now carry the spawn of this human," Zorn continues, his voice dripping with disgust. "A feat previously thought impossible with non-Iconian species. I demand justice." The Senate explodes into pandemonium once more. Chen spots Earth's allies huddling together, whispering furiously. Their support, crucial for humanity's standing in the galactic community, now hangs by a thread. Meanwhile, Earth's enemies barely conceal their glee, seeing an opportunity to isolate humanity once and for all. As accusations fly and demands for sanctions against Earth grow louder, Chen's comlink buzzes. It's a message from Chris himself, still on Icarus Prime. She reads it, her eyes widening in disbelief. "I'm in love with Rhea," the message states simply. "I won't leave her or her sisters. We're going to make this work." Chen looks up from her comlink to see King Zorn's hologram looming over her. "Ambassador," he growls, "I will break off all relations with Earth unless this Chris Murray agrees to marry all three of my daughters. Those are my terms." The fate of human-Iconian relations, and possibly the future of interstellar diplomacy, now rests on the decisions made in this chamber. As Chen steps forward to address the Senate, she knows that every word she utters will shape the course of human history among the stars. Chen's mind raced as she faced King Zorn's hologram, the fate of human-Iconian relations hanging in the balance. Before she could respond, a tall, uniformed figure strode onto the Senate floor, his presence commanding immediate attention. "King Zorn," the man's deep voice resonated through the chamber, "I am Admiral James Hawthorne of Earth's Diplomatic Corps. With your permission, I will travel to Icarus Prime immediately to address this situation in person." The Iconian ruler's crystalline eyes narrowed, but he nodded curtly. "Very well, Admiral. You have 3 standard days to reach our world." As the hologram flickered out, Chen turned to Hawthorne, relief evident on her face. "Thank you, Admiral, but how did you—" "No time for explanations, Ambassador," Hawthorne cut her off, already moving towards the exit. "I need to get to Icarus Prime now." 48 hours later, Admiral Hawthorne's sleek diplomatic vessel touched down on the iridescent plains of Icarus Prime. As he descended the ramp, he braced himself for the sight of the allegedly unattractive Iconian princesses. What greeted him instead left him momentarily stunned. Three statuesque figures approached, their blue skins shimmering like polished sapphires in the alien sunlight. Their features were delicate yet strong, with high cheekbones and large expressive eyes that seemed to change color with each movement. Hawthorne blinked, his preconceptions shattering. "Welcome to Icarus Prime, Admiral," the tallest of the three said, her voice melodious. "I am Princess Rhea. These are my sisters, Thea and Dion." Hawthorne gathered his wits. "Your Highnesses, it's an honor. I must say, you're not quite what I expected." Rhea's lips curved in a wry smile. "Yes, we've heard about our reputation. It seems human and Iconian standards of beauty are quite different." As they walked towards the palace, Hawthorne's mind whirled. The entire basis of this diplomatic crisis had just shifted beneath his feet. Inside the palace, Chris Murray sat in a lavishly appointed room, his status somewhere between guest and prisoner. When Hawthorne entered, the young diplomat jumped to his feet. "Admiral, I can explain—" Hawthorne held up a hand. "At ease, Murray. I need to hear everything. From the beginning." Over the next hour, Chris poured out his story. He described his growing closeness with Rhea, their shared interests, and the genuine connection that had blossomed between them. His voice softened as he spoke of her intelligence and compassion. "And Thea and Dion?" Hawthorne prompted. Chris's face flushed. "That was a cultural misunderstanding. In Iconian royal tradition, all siblings must be treated equally in matters of courtship. I was trying to respect their customs, but things escalated quickly." Hawthorne rubbed his temples. "Murray, do you realize the gravity of this situation? King Zorn is demanding you marry all three princesses or face the consequences." Before Chris could respond, alarms blared throughout the palace. Outside, the sound of angry voices and breaking glass filled the air. "What's happening?" Hawthorne demanded, moving to the window. A guard burst into the room. "It's Prince Xerxes and his followers. They're protesting against the human presence and the pregnancies." Hawthorne watched as the streets below filled with Iconians, their skin flashing patterns of anger and fear. He turned to Chris, his expression grim. "Murray, King Zorn has decreed that you must undergo the Iconian trials to prove your worth. It may be our only chance to salvage this situation." Chris swallowed hard but nodded. "I'll do whatever it takes, Admiral." As night fell on Icarus Prime, a figure slipped into Chris's room. He started, then relaxed as he recognized Rhea's elegant form. "Chris," she whispered, moving into his arms. "I had to see you. There's something you need to know." She explained the accelerated progress of the pregnancies, the babies due in mere weeks rather than months. Chris staggered under the weight of this new information. "Rhea, I love you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Whatever happens, we'll face it together." Outside, the protest grew louder. Inside the palace, King Zorn raged and plotted, and in a quiet room, a human and an Iconian clung to each other, their impossible love now the catalyst for events that would reshape the galaxy. As dawn broke, Chris steeled himself for the trials ahead. The first test loomed, a challenge that would push him to his physical and mental limits. With Rhea's love, the fate of 3 worlds, and the future of his unborn children driving him forward, Chris Murray prepared to face the unknown. As dawn broke over Icarus Prime, Chris Murray stood at the window of his quarters, watching the alien sun paint the iridescent landscape in hues of gold and violet. His heart raced with a mixture of anticipation and dread. Today, he would face the first of the Iconian trials. A soft knock at the door pulled him from his reverie. Admiral Hawthorne entered, his face a mask of stern professionalism. "It's time, Murray," he said, his voice low and steady. "Are you ready?" Chris nodded, squaring his shoulders. "As ready as I'll ever be, sir." They made their way through the winding corridors of the palace, the air thick with tension. As they approached the grand arena, the roar of the crowd grew louder, a cacophony of alien voices that sent shivers down Chris's spine. The arena itself was a marvel of Iconian architecture, its crystalline walls refracting the sunlight into dazzling patterns. Chris's eyes widened as he took in the sheer scale of the structure and the sea of blue-skinned spectators filling every available space. At the center of the arena stood a labyrinthine obstacle course, its twisting paths and towering structures designed to challenge even the most agile Iconians. Chris swallowed hard, his mouth suddenly dry. King Zorn's voice boomed across the arena, amplified by some unseen technology. "Let the first trial begin." Chris stepped forward, his heart pounding in his ears. He caught sight of Rhea, Thea, and Diona in the royal box, their swollen bellies a stark reminder of what was at stake. Rhea's eyes met his, and he drew strength from her silent encouragement. The starting signal blared, and Chris launched himself into the course. He scrambled up sheer walls, his muscles straining against Earth's lighter gravity. He leaped across chasms, his body twisting in mid-air to avoid swinging obstacles. Each movement was a calculated risk, pushing the limits of his human physiology. The crowd's initial jeers turned to murmurs of surprise as Chris progressed through the course. He might not have had the natural grace of an Iconian, but his purpose and adaptability were undeniable. As he neared the finish line, Chris's lungs burned, and his limbs felt like lead. With a final burst of energy, he hurled himself across the threshold, collapsing onto the arena floor. A hush fell over the crowd, followed by a smattering of applause that grew into a reluctant roar. Chris had completed the course, not with record-breaking speed, but with a display of human resilience that even the Iconians couldn't ignore. As Chris struggled to his feet, catching his breath, a commotion near the royal box caught his attention. Prince Xerxes, his iridescent skin flashing patterns of anger, strode onto the arena floor. "This is an outrage," Xerxes bellowed, his voice carrying across the now silent arena. "A human should not be allowed to compete for Iconian royalty. I demand a true test of worth, hand-to-hand combat." King Zorn leaned forward, his crystalline eyes glinting with cruel amusement. "Very well, my son. Let it be so." Chris's stomach dropped as he realized the implications of this new challenge. He was about to face an opponent nearly twice his size, with no time to recover from the grueling obstacle course. As the combat arena was hastily prepared, Admiral Hawthorne approached Chris, his face tight with concern. "Murray, you don't have to do this," he said in a low voice. "We can find another way." Chris shook his head, his eyebrows furrowed. "No, sir. I have to see this through." The combat began with a flurry of motion. Prince Xerxes charged forward, his massive form a blur of blue and silver. Chris ducked and weaved, relying on his agility to avoid the Iconian's powerful blows. As the fight progressed, Chris's mind raced, recalling every alien martial art he'd studied during his diplomatic training. He couldn't match Xerxes for strength, but he could outsmart him. Chris feinted left, then dropped low, sweeping Xerxes' legs out from under him. The prince crashed to the ground with a thunderous impact. The crowd gasped, then fell silent, watching in disbelief as the human and Iconian grappled on the arena floor. Using a combination of leverage and quick thinking, Chris managed to maneuver Xerxes into a submission hold. The prince thrashed and struggled, but Chris held firm, his muscles screaming with the effort. After what seemed like an eternity, Xerxes' movement slowed, and he tapped the ground in surrender. The arena erupted into chaos, a mixture of cheers and outraged cries filling the air. King Zorn rose to his feet, his face a mask of shock and scarcely controlled fury. "The human wins," he announced, his voice strained. As Chris was led away from the arena, he caught sight of Rhea. Her eyes shone with a mixture of pride and concern, and he felt a renewed surge of dedication. Whatever challenges lay ahead, he would face them for her, for their unborn child, and for the future of human-Iconian relations. Little did Chris know that as he prepared for the next trial, forces were already in motion that would reshape the galaxy's balance of power. The accelerated development of the human-Iconian hybrids, the shifting public opinion on Icarus Prime, and the growing tensions within the Iconian royal family were all converging into a perfect storm of interstellar politics. As night fell on Icarus Prime, Chris lay in his quarters, his body aching from the day's trials but his mind racing with possibilities. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new dangers, and perhaps new allies. The fate of two species hung in the balance, and Chris Murray found himself at the very center of it all. As dawn broke on Icarus Prime, Chris Murray found himself facing yet another day of trials and challenges. The aches from yesterday's physical ordeal still lingered in his muscles, but he knew he couldn't afford to dwell on them. Today would bring new tests, new dangers, and perhaps new allies. Chris had barely finished his morning meal when Admiral Hawthorne entered his quarters, his face grave. "Murray, we've received intel about potential sabotage," Hawthorne said in a low voice. "Prince Xerxes isn't taking his defeat lightly. We're enhancing security, but stay alert." Chris nodded, feeling a mix of apprehension and dedication. "Understood, sir. What's the next trial?" "A test of mental acuity in the Grand Iconian Library," Hawthorne replied. "You'll be up against their top scholars. Good luck." As they made their way to the library, Chris couldn't help but notice the increased presence of both human and Iconian security personnel. The atmosphere in the city seemed tenser than before, with groups of Iconians whispering among themselves as he passed. The Grand Iconian Library was a marvel of architecture and technology. Holographic displays flickered between towering shelves of ancient tomes, creating a dreamlike landscape of knowledge. Chris stood at the entrance, taking in the sight of his Iconian competitors, each a paragon of their species' intellectual elite. King Zorn's voice boomed through the library. "Let the second trial commence." Suddenly, the library transformed. Holographic puzzles and riddles materialized in the air, forming a complex maze that stretched as far as the eye could see. Chris took a deep breath and plunged in. The first few challenges were daunting. Alien symbols shifted and rearranged themselves, forming patterns that seemed to defy human logic. But as Chris worked through each puzzle, he began to notice something. His human perspective, so different from the Iconians, allowed him to see solutions that they overlooked. He breezed through a series of quantum logic gates that had several Iconian scholars scratching their heads. When faced with a three-dimensional, chess-like game, Chris's experience with human strategy games gave him an edge. As he progressed, Chris could hear murmurs of surprise and grudging admiration from the Iconian spectators. Even some of his competitors were casting him curious glances. Midway through the trial, just as Chris was deciphering a particularly complex star chart, chaos erupted. The library's gravity suddenly failed, sending books, holograms, and Iconians floating into the air. Chris's space training kicked in immediately. He pushed off from a nearby shelf, propelling himself toward a group of panicking Iconian scholars. Using techniques honed in the zero-gravity simulations, he helped guide them to safety, securing them to stable structures. As he maneuvered through the floating debris, Chris caught sight of several suspicious-looking Iconians attempting to sabotage the library's control systems. Without hesitation, he launched himself toward them, using floating books as improvised projectiles to disrupt their efforts. Admiral Hawthorne, watching from a security feed, quickly dispatched a team to apprehend the saboteurs. Meanwhile, Chris continued to assist stranded Iconians, his quick thinking and adaptability on full display. When the gravity finally stabilized, Chris found himself at the center of attention. King Zorn, who had been observing from a secure location, approached with a mix of reluctance and curiosity in his crystalline eyes. "You have performed admirably, human," the king said, his tone carefully neutral. "Perhaps there is more to your species than we initially believed." Chris inclined his head respectfully but remained silent, knowing that any words he spoke now could be twisted against him. As the day progressed, Chris found himself increasingly worried about Rhea. The accelerated nature of her pregnancy greatly troubled on his mind. During a brief recess, he sought out Dr. Elena Rodriguez, the human xenobiologist assigned to study the hybrid pregnancies. Dr. Rodriguez's eyes lit up as she saw Chris approach. "Mr. Murray, I'm glad you're here. We've made some fascinating discoveries about the hybrid embryos." She pulled up a holographic display showing the rapid development of the unborn children. "Their cognitive and physical development is off the charts. We're seeing potential for abilities that neither humans nor Iconians possess individually." Chris stared at the display, a mix of awe and concern washing over him. "Is Rhea in any danger?" "We're monitoring her closely," Dr. Rodriguez assured him. So far, she's handling the pregnancy remarkably well, but we're prepared for any complications. As they spoke, Chris noticed an increase in activity around the library. Alien diplomats from various species were arriving, their curiosity piqued by the news of the human-Iconian hybrid pregnancies and the ongoing trials. Suddenly, a commotion erupted near the library's entrance. Chris turned to see Prince Xerxes, his face contorted with rage, charging towards him with a weapon in hand. Before Chris could react, a blur of blue intercepted the prince. It was Kira, an Iconian guard, tackling Xerxes to the ground. Security forces swarmed the area, quickly subduing the prince and his remaining supporters. As Xerxes was led away, he shouted, "This isn't over, human! Icarus Prime will never accept you!" Admiral Hawthorne appeared at Chris's side, his face grim. "Good work, Murray, but I'm afraid your challenges are just getting started. King Zorian has announced the third trial, a diplomatic negotiation with the Adosians." Chris felt a weight settle in his stomach. The Adosians were notorious for their labyrinthine politics and inscrutable customs. This would be the ultimate test of his diplomatic skills. As he prepared for the next trial, Chris couldn't shake the feeling that the fate of not just his relationship with Rhea, but the future of human-Iconian relations, and perhaps the entire galaxy, rested on his shoulders. With rekindled dedication, he set out to face whatever challenges lay ahead. As Chris prepared for the next trial, he couldn't shake the feeling that the fate of human-Iconian relations rested on his shoulders. The weight of responsibility seemed to increase with each passing moment. The grand hall where the diplomatic negotiations were to take place was a marvel of Iconian architecture. Crystalline structures spiraled upwards, creating a dazzling array of light and color. Chris stood at the entrance, taking deep breaths to calm his nerves. Admiral Hawthorne approached, his face etched with concern. "Murray, are you ready? The Adosians are notoriously difficult negotiators. This will be your toughest challenge yet." Chris nodded, his eyebrows furrowed. "I'm as ready as I'll ever be, sir." As they entered the hall, Chris was struck by the sight of the Adosians delegation. The aliens were tall, willowy creatures with iridescent skin that seemed to shift colors with their movements. Their multiple eyes blinked in unison as they regarded Chris with what he hoped was curiosity rather than disdain. King Zorian's voice boomed through the hall, signaling the start of the negotiations. "Let the third trial commence." Chris approached the negotiation table, acutely aware of the thousands of Iconian eyes watching his every move. The lead Adosian, a being named Xylof, spoke first, its voice a melodious trill. "Human, we understand you seek to establish trade relations between your species and the Iconians. What do you offer that we cannot provide?" Chris took a moment to gather his thoughts, recalling everything he had learned about Adosian culture and trade practices. He began to speak, his words carefully chosen to navigate the complex web of Adosian etiquette. "Esteemed Xylof, while the Adosians undoubtedly possess great wealth and resources, humans offer a unique perspective. Our adaptability and creativity have allowed us to solve problems in ways that other species might not consider. We propose a three-way trade agreement that would benefit all parties involved." As Chris delved into the intricacies of his proposal, he noticed a shift in the Adosians' body language. Their color-changing skin began to pulse with hues of blue and green, which Chris hoped indicated interest. The negotiations continued for hours, with Chris deftly maneuvering through the labyrinth of Adosian protocols. He drew on his diplomatic experience, but also on the insights he had gained during his time on Icarus Prime. He found himself referencing Iconian cultural touchstones, bridging the gap between the three species in a way that seemed to impress both the Adosians and the watching Iconians. Just as Chris felt he was making significant progress, a commotion erupted at the back of the hall. Dr. Elena Rodriguez burst in, her face pale with urgency. "Mr. Murray, it's Princess Rhea. She's gone into labor." The hall erupted into chaos. Chris's heart raced as he processed the information. Without hesitation, he turned to the Adosian delegation. "Esteemed Xylof, I apologize, but I must attend to a medical emergency. I hope we can continue these promising negotiations at a later time." To Chris's surprise, Xylof's skin shifted to a deep purple. "We understand, human. Go to your mate. We will wait." Chris didn't need to be told twice. He raced out of the hall, following Dr. Rodriguez to the medical facility. As they ran, she briefed him on the situation. The accelerated gestation has caused complications we didn't anticipate. We're doing everything we can, but Ria's condition is critical. They burst into the medical bay, where Ria lay on a bed, surrounded by a team of human and Iconian medical professionals. Her iridescent skin was pale and her breathing labored. Chris rushed to her side, taking her hand in his. "I'm here, Ria. I'm right here with you." Ria's eyes fluttered open, a weak smile crossing her face. "Chris, our child." Before she could finish, her body convulsed in pain. The medical team sprang into action, their voices urgent as they worked to stabilize her condition. Dr. Rodriguez turned to Chris, her face grave. "We need to perform an emergency procedure, but our equipment isn't designed for Iconian physiology. We're improvising as best we can." As if on cue, the lights in the medical bay flickered and dimmed. An alarm blared, indicating a power failure. Chris's mind raced, adrenaline coursing through his veins. "What do you need?" he asked, ready to do whatever it took to save Ria and their child. Dr. Rodriguez pointed to a complex piece of medical equipment. "We need to keep that machine running. It's monitoring the baby's vital signs." Chris nodded, his space training kicking in. He quickly assessed the situation, looking for any way to maintain power to the critical systems. As he worked, he could hear the medical team's frantic efforts to save Ria and the child. Suddenly, the door to the medical bay slid open. To Chris's astonishment, King Zorn entered, followed by a group of Edosian medical experts. The Edosian leader, Xyloth, stepped forward. "We offer our assistance. Our medical knowledge may prove useful in this unique situation." For a moment, the room fell silent. Then King Zorn nodded, his crystalline eyes reflecting a mix of concern and hope. "We accept your help. Save my daughter and grandchild." As the Edosian experts joined the medical team, Chris felt a glimmer of hope. He turned back to his task, determined to keep the life support systems running. The fate of not just Ria and their child, but potentially the future of interspecies relations, hung in the balance. Outside the medical bay, a crowd had gathered. Humans, Iconians, and now Edosians stood side by side, united in their concern for the unfolding drama. As the hours ticked by, Chris worked tirelessly, his mind focused solely on the task at hand. The sound of Ria's labored breathing and the urgent voices of the medical team filled the air, a constant reminder of the high stakes of this unprecedented birth. The tension in the room was palpable as Chris worked tirelessly to keep the life support systems running. Suddenly, a blinding flash illuminated the sky outside, visible through the medical bay's windows. The solar flare had reached its peak, and the power systems throughout Icarus Prime began to fail. The lights in the medical bay flickered ominously, and the life support machines emitted a series of alarming beeps. Dr. Rodriguez's face paled. "We're losing power. We need to stabilize these systems now, or we risk losing both Ria and the baby." Chris's mind raced, searching for a solution. His eyes darted around the room, landing on a potted plant in the corner, an Iconian species known for its bioluminescent properties. A spark of inspiration hit him. "The Lumina plant," Chris exclaimed. "We can use its bioluminescence for emergency lighting." Without hesitation, he grabbed the pot and carefully extracted the glowing foliage. Working swiftly, Chris distributed the plant's leaves around the critical equipment, providing a soft blue-green glow that illuminated the vital readouts. Dr. Rodriguez nodded approvingly. "Brilliant, Chris. This might just give us the edge we need." The medical team redoubled their efforts, their faces bathed in the ethereal light of the Lumina plant. Ria's labored breathing filled the air, punctuated by the urgent instructions of the doctors. Hours passed, each moment a battle against time and failing technology. Chris moved between assisting the medical team and maintaining the makeshift power systems, his body running on pure adrenaline. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, a new sound pierced the tense atmosphere. The cry of a newborn. Chris's head snapped up, his eyes wide with disbelief and joy. Dr. Rodriguez's voice rang out, filled with relief and wonder. "It's a girl, and she's incredible." Chris rushed to Ria's side, his heart pounding. There, cradled in her arms, was their daughter, a tiny being with iridescent blue skin and startlingly human eyes. As Chris gazed into those eyes, he felt an overwhelming surge of emotion. The baby returned his gaze with an intensity that seemed beyond her newborn status, her eyes focusing on him with unusual clarity. "She's beautiful," Chris whispered, gently taking the child in his arms. The moment their skin touched, he felt a powerful connection, transcending the barriers of species and genetics. Rhea smiled weakly, her eyes shining with tears of joy. "Our daughter," she murmured. The tender moment was interrupted by a commotion outside the delivery room. Dr. Rodriguez rushed to the door, her face a mix of excitement and concern. "It's Princesses Thea and Dion," she announced. "They've both gone into labor." The medical bay erupted into controlled chaos as the team split into groups to manage the simultaneous deliveries. Chris found himself moving between rooms, offering support and assistance wherever he could. King Zorn arrived, his crystalline eyes wide with a mixture of worry and anticipation as he watched the births of his grandchildren unfold. Outside the medical facility, word of the successful birth spread rapidly. Crowds of Iconians gathered, their initial skepticism giving way to curiosity and, surprisingly, hope. The air buzzed with excitement as they awaited news of the other two deliveries. Admiral Hawthorne seized the moment, engaging King Zorn in rapid negotiations. "Your Majesty," he began, "this is an unprecedented opportunity. I propose we establish a joint human Iconian research facility to study and care for these remarkable children." King Zorn, his gaze still fixed on the medical bay doors, nodded slowly. Perhaps there is wisdom in your words, Admiral. We shall discuss this further." As the hours passed, two more cries joined the first. Princesses Thea and Dion had successfully given birth to their hybrid children, a boy and another girl. The medical bay was alive with the sounds of new life and the relieved chatter of the medical team. Chris stood in the center of it all, his newborn daughter in his arms, watching as the Iconian royal family cooed over their new additions. The atmosphere had shifted dramatically from the tension of the trials to one of joy and possibility. Xylof, the Adosian leader, approached Chris, its skin shimmering with hues of deep purple and gold. "Human," it trilled, "you have shown great courage and quick thinking in the face of adversity. We would be honored if you would consider leading the trade negotiations on behalf of both humans and Iconians." Chris blinked in surprise, the weight of the offer settling on his shoulders. Before he could respond, King Zorn stepped forward, his expression thoughtful. "Chris Murray," the king began, his voice carrying a note of reluctant respect. "You have proven yourself in ways I did not anticipate. Perhaps there is a place for you here on Icarus Prime, should you choose to accept it." As the power systems began to stabilize and the immediate crisis passed, Chris found himself at a crossroads. He looked down at his daughter, then at Rhea, who watched him with hopeful eyes. The future stretched before him, full of possibilities and challenges. In the distance, a low alarm sounded, indicating an incoming transmission. Admiral Hawthorne's face grew serious as he listened to the message. He turned to Chris, his expression grim. "Murray, we have a situation. It seems news of the hybrid births has attracted some unsavory attention. We need to discuss security measures immediately." Chris nodded, his protective instincts flaring. As he prepared to hand his daughter back to Rhea, he caught sight of the gathered crowd outside, their faces filled with wonder and acceptance. He realized that his decision would impact not just his family, but potentially the future of human-Iconian relations and the stability of the entire sector. With a deep breath, Chris steeled himself for the challenges ahead. The path forward was uncertain, but one thing was clear: nothing would ever be the same again. Chris's mind raced as he processed Admiral Hawthorne's words. The joy of his daughter's birth was quickly overshadowed by the looming threat. He gently handed the newborn back to Rhea, planting a soft kiss on her forehead. "I'll be right back," he promised, his voice low and determined. As Chris followed Admiral Hawthorne out of the medical bay, the corridor bustled with activity. Human and Iconian personnel rushed back and forth, their faces etched with concern. The Admiral led Chris to a makeshift command center, where a holographic display flickered to life. We've intercepted communications from multiple unidentified vessels approaching Icarus Prime, Hawthorne explained, his finger tracing the projected flight paths. Their intentions are unclear, but given the timing, we can't assume they're friendly. Chris studied the display, his brow furrowed. Have we tried hailing them? No response, Hawthorne replied, shaking his head. We're preparing for all contingencies. Before Chris could respond, a familiar voice rang out behind them. Perhaps I can be of assistance. They turned to see Xylof, the Adosian leader, approaching. Its skin now shimmered with hues of deep blue and green, indicating a mix of concern and perseverance. Our sensors are more advanced than yours, Xylof explained. We may be able to gather more information about these vessels. Admiral Hawthorne nodded, gesturing for Xylof to join them at the display. As the Adosian interfaced with the holographic controls, Chris felt a tap on his shoulder. He turned to find King Zorn standing there, his crystalline eyes reflecting the flickering lights of the command center. Chris Murray, the Iconian monarch began, his voice grave, I find myself in need of your counsel. The birth of these hybrid children, it changes everything. We must decide how to proceed, not just for their safety, but for the future of our peoples. Before Chris could formulate a response, a commotion erupted near the entrance of the command center. A group of individuals in formal attire pushed their way through the crowd, led by a stern-faced woman with short silver hair and a man in a lab coat. I am Ambassador Zara Kavath, the woman announced, her voice carrying a hint of an otherworldly accent. We are representatives from the Intergalactic Senate. We've been dispatched to assess the situation here on Icarus Prime. The man in the lab coat stepped forward, extending his hand to Chris. Dr. Marcus Chen, geneticist. We heard about the hybrid births. This is an unprecedented event in galactic history. Chris shook the doctor's hand, feeling the weight of the moment. Welcome to Icarus Prime, he said, his voice steady despite the whirlwind of emotions within him. I'm Chris Murray. I'm afraid you've arrived at a rather tense moment. Ambassador Kavath's eyes narrowed as she surveyed the command center. So we see. Perhaps you can brief us on the current situation? As Chris began to explain, Xylof's voice cut through the conversation. We've identified the approaching vessels, the Adosian announced, its skin now a vibrant orange of excitement. They appear to be Xylorian. A hush fell over the command center. The Xylorians, known for their advanced biotechnology and reclusive nature, rarely ventured beyond their own star system. Dr. Chen's eyes widened. The Xylorians? Here? This is unprecedented. Chris felt a sudden urge to return to the medical bay, to check on Rhea and their daughter. As if reading his thoughts, King Zorn placed a hand on his shoulder. Go to them, the Iconian king said softly. We will handle the diplomatic preparations. Grateful, Chris nodded and hurried back to the medical bay. As he entered, he found Rhea cradling their daughter, with Princesses Thea and Dion nearby, each holding their own newborns. The sight filled Chris with a mix of joy and apprehension. Rhea looked up as he approached, her eyes questioning. What's happening out there? Chris sat beside her, gently stroking their daughter's iridescent cheek. It's complicated, he began, choosing his words carefully. The news of the births has attracted attention. The Intergalactic Senate has sent representatives, and we've got Xylorian ships approaching. Rhea's eyes widened. Xylorians? Here? Before Chris could respond, their daughter let out a soft coo, her eyes focusing on Chris with startling intensity. To his amazement, she opened her mouth and uttered a clear, distinct word. Daddy. Chris and Rhea exchanged shocked glances. Dr. Rodriguez, who had been monitoring the infants nearby, rushed over. Did she just... the doctor asked, her voice filled with disbelief. Chris nodded, his heart pounding. She did. She called me Daddy. Dr. Rodriguez quickly ran a series of scans on the infant, her face a mixture of excitement and confusion. This is incredible, she muttered. Her neural development is off the charts. I've never seen anything like it. As if on cue, the other two hybrid infants began to vocalize as well, forming simple words and sounds far beyond what should be possible for newborns. The medical bay erupted into a flurry of activity as the medical team scrambled to document and understand this unprecedented development. Amidst the chaos, Chris felt a tap on his shoulder. He turned to find Admiral Hawthorne standing there, his face grave. "Murray," the Admiral said, his voice low and urgent. "We need you back in the command center. The Xylorian ships are requesting permission to dock, and King Zorn is asking for your presence during the negotiations." Chris looked from the Admiral to Rhea and their daughter, torn between his duties and his desire to stay with his family. Rhea nodded encouragingly, sensing his dilemma. "Go," she said softly. "We'll be here when you return." With a heavy heart, Chris kissed Rhea and their daughter goodbye, then followed Admiral Hawthorne out of the medical bay. As they walked briskly through the corridors, Chris's mind raced with the implications of everything that had happened in the past few hours. The birth of the hybrid children, their incredible abilities, the arrival of the Intergalactic Senate representatives, and now the approaching Xylorian ships. It all pointed to a future far more complex and uncertain than Chris had ever imagined. As they approached the command center, he took a deep breath, steeling himself for whatever challenges lay ahead. The doors to the command center slid open, revealing a scene of controlled chaos. King Zorn stood at the center, deep in conversation with Ambassador Kavoth and Dr. Chen. Xyloth hovered nearby, its skin a kaleidoscope of colors reflecting the tension in the room. All eyes turned to Chris as he entered. King Zorn extended a hand, beckoning Chris to join them. "Chris Murray," the Iconian monarch began, his voice carrying a weight Chris had never heard before. "We find ourselves at a crossroads. The decisions we make in the coming moments will shape the future of not just our two species, but potentially the entire galactic community." Chris nodded, feeling the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. As he prepared to speak, a new alert sounded from the command console. The Xylorian ships had entered orbit around Icarus Prime. The future hung in the balance, and Chris knew that his next words and actions would be crucial in shaping what was to come. As Chris stepped forward to address the gathered leaders, the weight of the moment pressed upon him. "Representatives of Earth, Icarus Prime, and our esteemed guests," he began, his voice steady despite the tension in the room. "We stand at a crossroads of unprecedented opportunity." Before Chris could continue, alarms blared throughout the chamber, cutting through his words like a knife. The holographic displays flickered, revealing a massive Xylorian warship looming in orbit above Icarus Prime. Its sleek biomechanical form dwarfed the other vessels in the system, its weapon arrays primed and aimed directly at the planet's capital. The chamber erupted into chaos. Diplomats shouted over one another, security personnel rushed to protect their charges, and the air filled with a cacophony of translator devices struggling to keep up with the multilingual pandemonium. Suddenly, the central holoscreen crackled to life, revealing the imposing visage of the Xylorian Supreme Commander. Its compound eyes gleamed with an unsettling intelligence as it surveyed the assembled leaders. "Peoples of Earth and Icarus Prime," the Xylorian's voice reverberated through the chamber, translated into multiple languages simultaneously. "We demand the immediate surrender of the hybrid children for scientific study. Failure to comply will result in severe consequences." The threat hung in the air, silencing the chaotic din. Chris's mind raced, his eyes darting between the frightened faces of the assembled diplomats and the stern countenance of King Zorn. In that moment, he knew that his next actions would shape the future of not just two worlds, but potentially the entire galaxy. Taking a deep breath, Chris stepped forward, his voice cutting through the tense silence. "Supreme Commander, I am Chris Murray, representative of both Earth and Icarus Prime. I propose we discuss this matter face-to-face aboard your vessel." Gasps and murmurs rippled through the chamber. Admiral Hawthorne stepped forward, his face a mask of concern. "Murray, you can't be serious. It's too dangerous." Chris turned to the Admiral, his expression resolute. "It's the only way to grit this peacefully. We can't risk a conflict that could endanger millions of lives." King Zorn, who had been observing silently, now spoke. "I will accompany Chris Murray," he announced, his crystalline voice ringing with authority. "As ruler of Icarus Prime, it is my duty to protect my people and seek peaceful resolutions." The Zylorian Supreme Commander's compound eyes seemed to narrow, if such a thing were possible. After a moment of consideration, it nodded. Very well. We will receive your delegation aboard our ship. You have 1 standard hour to prepare. As the holoscreen winked out, Chris felt a hand on his arm. He turned to find Rhea standing beside him, her eyes blazing with commitment. I'm coming with you, she said, her voice brooking no argument. My knowledge of Iconian biology could be crucial, and as a mother of one of the hybrid children, I have a stake in these negotiations. Chris opened his mouth to protest, but the look in Rhea's eyes silenced him. He nodded, knowing that her presence could indeed prove invaluable. As they prepared to depart, Chris, Rhea, and King Zorn were outfitted with protective suits designed to withstand the alien environment of the Zylorian ship. A joint human-Iconian security team, led by a grim-faced Admiral Hawthorne, escorted them to the shuttle bay. The journey to the Zylorian vessel was tense and silent. Chris's mind whirled with possible negotiation strategies, acutely aware of the immense responsibility resting on his shoulders. As their shuttle approached the massive alien ship, he felt Rhea's hand slip into his, a gesture of support and unity. The Zylorian vessel's docking bay opened like a great maw, swallowing their shuttle whole. As they disembarked, Chris was struck by the alien beauty of the ship's interior. Bioluminescent patterns pulsed along organic-looking walls, and the air hummed with an energy that seemed almost alive. They were escorted through winding corridors by silent Zylorian guards, their insectoid forms towering over even the tallest members of the delegation. Finally, they arrived at what appeared to be a command center, where the Supreme Commander awaited them. Cesaric, as the Zylorian leader introduced itself, was even more imposing in person. Its exoskeleton shimmered with iridescent hues, and its mandibles clicked softly as it regarded the human Iconian delegation. Welcome aboard, representatives of Earth and Icarus Prime. Cesaric's voice resonated through the chamber. Now, let us discuss the fate of these hybrid children. Chris stepped forward, his heart pounding, but his voice steady. Supreme Commander Cesaric, before we begin, I'd like to propose an alternative to your demand, one that could benefit not just our peoples, but yours as well. Cesaric's antennae twitched with interest. Speak, human, we are listening. Drawing on every ounce of his diplomatic experience, Chris began to outline his proposal for a collaborative research initiative. As he spoke, he could see the subtle shifts in Cesaric's posture, the way its compound eyes focused intently on him. He pressed on, emphasizing the potential for mutual benefit and the importance of cooperation over conflict. Imagine, Chris said, his voice gaining strength, a program that brings together the greatest scientific minds from Earth, Icarus Prime, and Zyloria. We could study the hybrid children's unique biology while ensuring their safety and well-being. The knowledge we gain could revolutionize our understanding of genetics, potentially benefiting all our species. Cesaric remained silent for a long moment, its alien features unreadable. Then, to Chris's surprise, the Zylorian commander's exoskeleton began to pulse with colors, a sign of strong emotion. Your words are intriguing, Chris Murray, Cesaric said slowly. Perhaps there is wisdom in your proposal. Our own species faces a crisis of genetic degradation. We had hoped these hybrid children might hold the key to our survival. Chris seized on this revelation, his mind racing with the possibilities. Then let us work together, he urged. This collaborative research could not only benefit the hybrid children, but potentially help solve your species' genetic problems as well. As the negotiations progressed, Chris could sense a shift in the atmosphere. The initial hostility was giving way to cautious optimism. Even King Zorn, who had remained stoically silent, now contributed his own insights, adding weight to Chris's proposals. Just as it seemed they were making real progress, alarms blared throughout the Zylorian ship. Cesaric's exoskeleton flashed with agitated colors as it received reports from its subordinates. Treachery, Cesaric hissed. A group of extremists is attempting to seize control of the ship. They seek to capture your delegation and take the hybrid children by force. In that moment, as chaos erupted around them, Chris realized that the true test of their fledgling alliance was about to begin. The fate of 3 species now hung in the balance, and the next few moments would determine whether they face this threat as adversaries or allies.
If you finished this story, please subscribe and like the video. Then leave a comment that says, "I liked the story," and I will heart every single one of them. It really helps me. Thank you for your time.